A fortress of stone and steel rises from an isolated island battered by unforgiving waves and shrouded in an aura of fear. Its walls, thick and unyielding, have witnessed the slow erosion of hope, the broken spirits of men who dared to defy the system, and the calculated brutality of one of the most secure prisons in the world. Over decades, inmates have dreamed of freedom, plotted intricate escape plans, and tested the limits of human ingenuity, only to be met with failure, capture, or death. This is ADX Florence, America's most impenetrable prison. Nestled in the remote high deserts of Colorado, ADX Florence is officially known as the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility. But among those who have dared to challenge the law, it is simply called the Alcatraz of the Rockies. A supermax prison designed to house the most dangerous, violent, and high-profile criminals in the country. Terrorists, cartel leaders, spies, and serial killers all rot behind its walls, subjected to a system so tight, so meticulously controlled that not a single man has ever escaped. The moment an inmate arrives at ADX Florence, their world shrinks to the size of a concrete box. Prisoners are stripped of all illusions of power or influence, their reputations and past lives rendered meaningless inside these walls. No matter how notorious they were on the outside, whether they were drug lords, war criminals, or masterminds of terror, they all become the same, isolated, monitored, and forgotten. From the very first step into the prison, a new reality sets in. There is no noise, no chaos, no shouting inmates rattling cell bars. Instead, there is an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional mechanical hum of security doors sealing shut. The prison was designed with one goal in mind: to break men down, piece by piece, until they are nothing more than a shadow of who they once were. Unlike traditional prisons, where gangs rule certain areas and bribery can buy protection, ADX Florence is untouchable. The guards do not take chances. There are no weaknesses to exploit, no blind spots in security, no way to smuggle contraband in or out. Prisoners do not interact with one another. Even their limited recreation time is spent in individual concrete enclosures resembling dog kennels rather than exercise yards. For many, the first year in ADX Florence is the hardest. The complete sensory deprivation, the extreme loneliness, and the crushing realization that they will never again walk freely among society have driven inmates to paranoia, insanity, and suicide. Some spend hours speaking to themselves, others scream into the empty void of their cells until their voices grow hoarse. A few stop speaking altogether, retreating into a silence even deeper than the one forced upon them. But survival is possible if one learns to adapt. Some prisoners cling to routine, push-ups in the cramped space between the steel toilet and the bed, reading the same books over and over, counting the number of tiles on the ceiling. Others try to escape into their own minds, writing letters that may never be answered or staring at the tiny slit of a window, dreaming of the world beyond. The mind, after all, is the only thing they have left. For the guards, working in ADX Florence is a different kind of psychological test. Unlike regular prisons where inmates can socialize and form alliances, the men inside ADX are cut off from everything. There are no riots to break up, no fights to separate, just a prison full of ghosts. The guards rarely hear their voices, rarely see them in person. Orders are given through intercoms, meals are delivered through slots in the door, and when an inmate is moved, it is done with a small army of armed officers in riot gear. Yet, even in a place like ADX, danger always lingers. Some inmates have nothing left to lose, and their hatred for the system burns as hot as ever. There have been attacks on guards, makeshift weapons crafted from the most unexpected materials, and assassination attempts against high-profile inmates. Even in isolation, grudges remain. If a man has a name in the underworld, there is always someone willing to carry out vengeance, even from behind steel and concrete. But the most terrifying part of ADX Florence isn't just its inescapability. It's the fact that many of the men inside were once untouchable. Drug lords who controlled billions, terrorists who once commanded armies, spies who lived in the shadows, all of them brought down, stripped of everything, and reduced to numbers in a system that never forgets. The world they once ruled moves on without them, their legacies fading, their power reduced to nothing. There are prisons that criminals fear. Then there is ADX Florence, a place where fear becomes a permanent state of being. And yet, the true horror of ADX, the psychological toll of ADX Florence is as much a weapon as its towering walls and steel doors. Inmates are subjected to conditions so isolating that many develop severe mental illnesses over time. The lack of human contact, the endless silence, and the rigid monotony push even the strongest minds to their breaking point. Some prisoners spend years without ever feeling the touch of another person. For many, their only company is the sound of their own breathing, the occasional distant scream of another inmate, and the relentless ticking of time. One of the most notorious inmates, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, the former leader of the Sinaloa cartel, now exists in complete isolation within these walls. A man who once ruled over a billion-dollar empire, who escaped from maximum security prisons in Mexico with ease, now finds himself in a place where escape is not just unlikely, it's impossible. The very strategies that once made him untouchable, bribery, connections, sheer force, mean nothing here. In ADX Florence, power holds no value. And then there's the case of Ramzi Youssef, the mastermind behind the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. Once a ghostly figure operating in the shadows, evading authorities across multiple countries, he is now reduced to a forgotten name in an underground concrete tomb. His days are spent in complete solitude, his only interaction being the meals slid through a narrow slot in the door. He was once a man feared by governments, now he's just another ghost in a prison built to erase men from history. For some, escape isn't about breaking through walls or digging tunnels. It's about escaping the mind. Inmates have resorted to extreme methods to cope with the crushing isolation. Some gouge out their own eyes, others attempt suicide, and some retreat so deeply into their own minds that they are lost forever. Even the most dangerous criminals, men who have taken countless lives without remorse, find themselves begging for human interaction, for any sign that they still exist. ADX Florence was built on the foundation of absolute control. Even the guards, highly trained and carefully selected, operate under a system designed to eliminate mistakes. No bribes, no favors, no weaknesses. Surveillance cameras watch every move, motion detectors line the walls, and the entire facility is built in such a way that even if someone did manage to breach their cell, they would still have to navigate an inescapable maze of security barriers. The prison's architecture itself is a psychological weapon. The cells are positioned in such a way that inmates cannot even see the sky. The only view they have is through a tiny, 4-inch wide window angled toward the sky, ensuring they never see another human being. Even when they are allowed outside, it is in a small, caged-in area referred to as the dog run, where the walls are too high to see beyond. It is the ultimate form of sensory deprivation, no horizon, no landmarks, nothing but concrete and sky. Some of the men locked away here were once symbols of rebellion, defiance, and terror. They thrived in the chaos of the outside world where they could manipulate, scheme, and dominate. But in ADX Florence, there is no chaos to exploit. The silence is oppressive, the walls unbreakable, and the routine so rigid that even time itself feels frozen. Here, defiance is met with nothingness. The very idea of an escape attempt is not just foolish, it is suicide. The prison's perimeter is lined with motion sensors, laser detection systems, and a patrol of armed guards ready to shoot on sight. Even if an inmate somehow managed to break through multiple layers of security, they would find themselves in the desolate, freezing landscape of Colorado's high desert, where survival is nearly impossible. No one has ever even come close to making it out. ADX Florence is not just a prison, it is a place designed to erase men from the world. It is where names are forgotten, voices go unheard, and legends die in silence. While the outside world moves on, these prisoners remain trapped in a world that never changes, a world where time stands still, where every day is the same as the last, and where the only true escape is death. For the men inside, there is no redemption, no hope, no second chances. Only the walls, the silence, and the crushing realization that they will never see the outside world again. The very design of ADX Florence makes it a near impossible place to break out of. Unlike older prisons that relied on watchtowers and patrolling guards, ADX operates on an entirely different level. Each inmate is confined to a 7 by 12-foot concrete cell for 23 hours a day, with a single slit of a window 4 inches wide placed so high that no human could ever reach it. Through that narrow gap, prisoners can only see the sky and never the horizon, never a landmark, never a glimpse of anything that might orient them in the outside world. There are no bars, no communal spaces, no opportunities for contact between inmates. The cell doors are solid steel with remote-controlled electronic locks operated by guards in a secure control room. Even when an inmate is allowed out of their cell for the single hour of exercise, they are placed in an outdoor cage, a concrete pit resembling an empty swimming pool where they can see only the sky above. Escape in any conventional sense is impossible. But that has never stopped men from trying. Over the years, the most infamous criminals in modern history have been locked away in ADX Florence. El Chapo, the legendary cartel kingpin who had escaped from 2 maximum security prisons in Mexico, found himself here after being extradited to the United States. Known for tunneling out of prisons, bribing guards, and orchestrating elaborate escapes, El Chapo had no options left at ADX. His empire, which once reached every corner of the globe, now ended at the unbreakable concrete walls of his tiny cell. Then there was Ramzi Youssef, the mastermind behind the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. Before his capture, Youssef was a ghost, slipping through international borders with forged passports and carefully planned aliases. He had orchestrated bombings in the Philippines and had planned even deadlier attacks on U.S. airliners. But inside ADX Florence, his skills were useless. He now lived in solitary confinement, speaking to no one, forgotten by the world. Terry Nichols, one of the men responsible for the Oklahoma City bombing, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, the surviving Boston Marathon bomber, and Richard Reed, the infamous shoe bomber, all sit in ADX Florence, serving life sentences that will never end. Their days blur into one another, their existence reduced to nothing more than a countdown to death. The prison itself operates with a level of surveillance unparalleled anywhere in the world. The motion detectors, thermal imaging cameras, and pressure-sensitive floors ensure that no movement goes undetected. Guards monitor every hallway, every cell, every inch of space from a central control hub. No prisoner moves without their actions being meticulously tracked. And yet, despite its reputation for absolute control, ADX Florence has had its moments of chaos. In 2005, an inmate named Richard Santiago attacked another prisoner with a homemade shank, managing to stab him over 20 times before guards intervened. In another instance, a former FBI informant named William "Billy" Mayfield was found dead in his cell, strangled by another inmate. Despite being the most secure facility in America, ADX Florence is still home to some of the most violent men on the planet. But what makes ADX truly horrifying isn't just the impenetrable security, it's the psychological warfare waged against its inmates. Prisoners spend years in total isolation, often speaking to no one for days, weeks, even months. The silence is deafening. The lack of human contact drives men to madness. Some prisoners have mutilated themselves, while others have smeared their own blood on the walls in sheer desperation. Former Warden Robert Hood once described ADX Florence as a cleaner version of hell. One of the most notorious cases of psychological deterioration was that of Thomas Silverstein. He was once one of the most dangerous inmates in the federal prison system, convicted of murdering a prison guard. As punishment, he was placed in an isolated cell at ADX for 36 years, one of the longest stretches of solitary confinement in American history. Deprived of all human interaction, Silverstein's mind slowly unraveled. Yet, for all its horrors, ADX Florence remains a necessary evil in the eyes of the U.S. government. Without it, the most dangerous criminals in the country would have nowhere else to go. But the question remains, is absolute isolation a punishment worse than death? There have been legal battles over the conditions in ADX, with human rights organizations arguing that prolonged solitary confinement constitutes torture. Some former inmates have testified that their time in ADX left them mentally shattered, incapable of functioning as normal human beings. Others have described hearing voices, hallucinating, and experiencing violent outbursts as a result of years in near-total isolation. Yet, despite the lawsuits, despite the ethical concerns, ADX Florence continues to operate, unchallenged and undefeated. No man has ever escaped. No man likely ever will. And for those who enter its walls, there is only one certainty: they will die there.